Hi, I'm Sarah. We're gonna make a book. I think the easiest impressive book form is the accordion, which we're gonna make today. This is one example. This is another one. It's essentially the exact same thing, but with a different cover. So what we need is a couple strips of paper or one long strip of paper, like so. That's going to be the inside. We need something that's going to cover our boards. We need some sort of board. I took this off the back of a plain lined notebook. We need a brush for glue. This is the ideal bookbinding glue. It's called PVA, poly something. It's $5. It's really good. But if you don't have any kind of liquid glue, you can also make a wheat paste with what you have at home, if you are lucky enough to have flour, I guess. I've never made it before. Well, I have made it before. I've never used it before, but the basic recipe is just 1 part flour to 4 parts water, and you just cook it over over a flame and then refrigerate it afterwards. You can find recipes for that online if you want. So if you don't have glue, there are options, but let me know how it goes if you do that, because I've never done that before. I'm curious. Something you have to consider when you're looking at your strip is the grain of the paper. Grain means the fibers that the paper is made of, whether they're running long ways or short ways, and that's going to influence how your paper folds. If you've ever noticed that thick paper can have kind of a jagged looking fold, it's because you're probably folding it against the grain and you want to go with the grain. So these have the grain correctly. You'll see resistance the wrong way. This doesn't fold very well like this, so I'm not going to try to fold it that way. I want to fold it with the grain. All right, a good tool for that is a bone folder if you have one, but if you don't, you can just use your fingernail or a smooth object, maybe a rock, a polished rock would work. All right, so to fold our accordion, you just go one way, and then make sure your fold's nice and flat. Then you're gonna go the other way. I hope you can see this. And then flip it over and fold it back. So you've got a little MW. You're going to do that for both, or if you have just one strip, you're going to do that along the whole strip. Same way. And these were dyed with a dip dye. That's pretty easy. All you do is take Rit dye if you have that. Probably food coloring would work too, or even natural materials. Although that always sounds better in theory than it ends up being. But you just submerge it in your dye, and then if you want to do some sort of gradient, you could do longer in the bottom and then a little bit as you submerge, if that makes sense. All right. So now that we have everything folded, we've got our 2. We're going to want to okay, I have to reverse my folds for this, only because I want the dip dye to look a certain way. It doesn't really matter if you're just doing one continuous but I want that to form a continuous like valley there. So now I'm ready to do my hinge, and I'm gonna do just a not particularly professional looking hinge, because we're just going to use what we have at home and kind of try to you know, cut down on the fussiness of it. That's not the point right now. Even though bookbinding in general is a very like pretentious craft, or can be, and people have a lot of differing opinions about it. All right, so I'm just going to take regular tape. Ideally it would be invisible tape, but I don't have any, so this is just plain old satin. And I'm gonna cut it down to be about half width. So I'm gonna take my box cutter here and a ruler and just make it a little thinner. Self-healing mats are really good for this if you have one. And try to avoid getting, you know, hair or whatever in there. If you have a side that you want to be the front, make sure you're taping on the back. Although the beauty of this form is that you can do designs on either side. All right, so my next thing I want to do is line these up. Like so, and then you can put some sort of weight on either side to keep them in place. So as you can see, my seam is right down the middle here. I've got things on either side to hold it down. Take my tape. Gonna put it over the seam, making sure that it goes all the way across and is stuck to my surface, because that way I can get a really clean line on either side. So then you take your weights off. I need this. Trim it off. And trim it off. So now we've got a continuous strip. This is going to be the inside of our book. All right, next part we're going to make is the boards. So take your notepad backing, whatever it is that you have. Book board is good. It's really thick. It's also really hard to cut, and that can mean it's hard to kind of get a good, two identical pieces cut exactly the same is a little tough with book board. So something in between is nice. I like using this. So we're going to take our book. This is called our book block. And we're going to just put it on the board and trace around it. Don't get like super, super close. I mean, you're going to trace it on there. We're going to make it essentially the same size, but make sure you don't make it smaller than that. Might actually do this one in the corner here. Make sure that the edges that you're not cutting are flat and square. What I mean by that is this edge and this edge. If those were wonky, I would want to try to not use those as any kind of measuring. All right, so now we're ready to cut. Again, we're going to make sure we don't undercut the boards. We want them to at least cover the book block. You might have to do a couple passes. Kind of fucked that up. I'm going to go back and do it again a little bit. that's one board, as you can see. And then the next. All right. So now we've got our two boards. They should be the same size as each other and the same size as our book block, or maybe a little bit bigger, but yeah, that looks perfect. All right, so the next step is to glue these down. And that's pretty straightforward. If you're gonna do like a real case binding, which is what wraps around like a stitched book, like a hardbound book, for example, as a case binding, you're gonna be more exact in your proportions of how you do this, but for the purpose of this project, we can just totally eyeball it, which is nice. So we're gonna make sure that we have, actually, I think I'm gonna go the other way. Have a little more room. You're just gonna kind of eyeball these in the center, and then trace them on there. If they're off a little bit, you'll want to make sure you remember which goes in which outline, but if they're more or less exactly the same, don't worry about it. This is just to help us estimate, the outline. We don't have to do this step if we don't want to, but I think it's a little easier, just cut down on all the room for error. So the next thing we're gonna do is glue. I should probably have some sort of, some sort of scratch paper. So I'm gonna take this handbook. I don't really need it, but I kind of do. I'll just take the front. All right, so this just makes it so you don't get glue everywhere. An important thing about glue when you're bookbinding is that you want to try to always challenge yourself to use as little as possible. That's gonna cut down on your overall warp possibilities, and also keep your decorative paper from bubbling too much. But you want it to stick, so it's a fine line. That's why I like PVA. It kind of makes that pretty easy. So you're gonna take your brush, start in the center, and work your way out. All right, once you got that covered in glue but not totally saturated, you're gonna stick that down on one of your outlines. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just cut myself with that. Although you do want it, if possible, if your design is super symmetrical, you're gonna want your board to be going in the right, as flat as possible, or else it's gonna look a little wonky. All right, I shouldn't have done that directly on top of my glue, but it's okay, none of it offset. So we're gonna do that again on the other. It's important to work from the center outwards because that's gonna cut down on your potential for kind of letting the brush slip underneath and getting glue on the other side. All right. Get that out of the way this time, and then set it down. And you want to work quickly because the less glue you use, the more quickly it's going to dry. All right, now I'm going to burnish this a little bit with my bone folder, which just means, you know, kind of make sure that glue is really sticking. So now we're ready to cut. We want to just leave a little bit of a frame around each board. I have kind of a small sheet here. I didn't do myself any favors, but I like the paper, so that's the trade-off. And what I mean by that is that the gutter between the two is going to be a little tight. It's not going to be a huge deal for this. We're just going to want to cut them apart evenly. In theory, you won't see any of the back of this. We're still going to do it neatly, but it doesn't really matter what it looks like. All right. So now I'm just going to kind of trim off the excess to mirror that gutter. Doesn't have to be perfect. So now each of my boards is glued to a piece of paper that is slightly larger than the board, as you can see. And our next step is going to be to trim the corners a little bit, because ultimately this is going to help us have neat corners that don't kind of bulk out at the ends. If you're wrapping, you can kind of imagine that this corner where it overlaps with the wrap on the next edge is going to be kind of bulky, so we don't want that. We're gonna trim them like so. Again, when case binding, there are kind of more accurate measurements that you'll want to do, but for this, anything we take off is going to help us. So we've got our little cut corners, and we're going to do that all around. All right, so we're gonna get our scrap slip sheet of paper back, and now we're gonna do the actual gluing. So you just wanna take a tiny little bit for this, hardly anything. If you're using a glue stick, that should work fine. I mean, glue sticks are kind of, they can be sort of chunky. They can come off in little chunks that is not particularly fun to work with, but it can definitely be done. So if that's what you have, that's what you should use. Or make with a wheat paste. Alright, so I've got my one flap. Hope you can see what I'm doing here. And what I'm gonna do now that I have one corner down is I'm gonna press the excess with my nail, just a little bit, just kind of score that so that it goes down, as you can see, just press in there. All right, and then we're gonna continue our gentle gluing, working outwards again, trying not to get any glue underneath, and also trying not to use too much. But that is a muscle that you will develop if you like doing this kind of thing. All right, the thinner your paper is, the easier this is gonna go, obviously. That's why I like to use origami paper. It's pretty forgiving. All right. Pinch down again, fold over. Smoothing out any air bubbles. That's another reason origami paper is good. I'm not doing a great job of keeping my boards out of the glue, but PVA is it's not super shiny or anything when it dries, so if you get a little bit, you'll probably be fine. All right, pinching again, and then folding over. At this point, I'm gonna do it for both, but at this point, you may have a board that's kind of warped. Mine's not, it's pretty flat. It was a little warped at first, and then the process of putting the paper on kind of reversed the warp, making the overall thing pretty flat. But you can always put this under weight, which is basically just a stack of books or whatever it is you have on hand, to make sure that it dries flat. And you'll do that after this step and probably once again at the end, if your board's warped. I'm not gonna do that right now because I don't have to, which is good. So just continue our process here of flattening down our corners. Trying not to glue the book to your workspace. You can use wax paper too. I don't like to because it's gonna keep your form from drying a little bit. I like to just use regular printer paper. Alright, almost done. I will save the video, so if you want to see what the steps are afterwards, or if you're not following along right now, and you want to do it later, you should. And then send me what you make, because I'd really like to see. All right. I mean, don't physically send it to me. You should keep it. Send me a picture. All right, and since I've done a few of these lately, I have noticed that the corners have a little bit of excess hanging off, and so it's no problem at all to just clip it. I like these little Fiskars scissors. They're really good for bookbinding because they're tiny, they're sharp. These are just suggested supplies though. You can always just use what you have. All right. And now I'm ready, almost, for the final. All right, so now I have my 2 boards, as you can see. They're cute and ready to go. And as you can see, the backs are not like in any way perfect, but you're not going to see it. This one's better. This one's got a little more consistency around the edges, but that's why they're the same size as our book block, is because that's really a forgiving way to work. All right, so now this is the big finish. Your seam should be taped down at this point, or the hinge rather is what we call that. And there's like a fancier book binding way of doing it where you just take a strip of paper and glue it down the center, which looks a little more polished. You're free to do that obviously, but for this purpose, we just use tape. Okay, so what we're gonna do, and this is the hardest part, but also you can't change it once you do it, so try to, just be careful, take your time, get it right. You can pull it off and glue it again, but you don't want to do that a bunch, or you might mess up your first little seam here. All right, so what we're gonna do is put our boards up here. I'm just gonna do a time check to see if I, oh, okay. So this is gonna be over in 2 minutes, so I'm gonna do this fast. Or maybe I'll start another. All right. You can see that I put the book block mostly underneath this paper, leaving just the first flap up. You're going to use probably a little more glue when you do this step if your book block is made of a pretty thick paper, which mine is. We want it to stick, and the origami paper doesn't need much, but this does. All right, so now that I've got that all glued, I'm just gonna flop it down basically onto this. Making sure that everything is on there. All right, so now that I've got it pretty much stuck, I'm gonna take my bone folder and I'm gonna burnish it. It's gonna cut me off any second, but I'll just start again. Not for very long. We'll just finish it after it cuts me off. All right, so that's one side, as you can see. Now we're gonna go to the other. And I lost my sheet of paper. All right, that was a good stick. All right. Do again with the other side. All right, flop it over. And since we are using a little more glue, we can kind of position it a little better. Burnishing again. All right, that's it. We made our accordion book. So now we want to just put this under weight to make sure that it dries flat and looks the way we want it to. And an important thing there is just to put a couple of slip sheets in between, which is just like a scrap of paper, so that it doesn't glue itself together. Put it under a stack of books and you have an accordion book. That's what I'm going to go do right now. As you can see, it's kind of, the board's not super heavy, so at this point it doesn't want to stay closed. Putting it under weight is going to help reinforce those folds. This is just going to be my slip sheet, some pieces without glue, ideally. And that's that. Maybe next time I will do some sort of home printmaking, if anybody is interested. All right, thanks. I thought I was gonna get cut off by now, so I didn't really prepare a final speech. Bye.